Welcome, everyone, to the Retirement Success in Maine podcast. My name is Ben Smith, and I'm one of your co hosts here on the show. Listeners, I hope you're doing well today. If you'd like to connect with us, you can always just email us at bensmith@guidancepointrs.com or find us on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Just search Retirement Success in Maine podcast, and you can find more of our shows there. And now I'd like to welcome the Abbot to my Costello, Curtis Wister. How are you doing today, Curtis?
I'm doing well, Ben. I'm doing well. How are you?
Really good. It's we're recording in January and it's cold here in Maine.
It
We
is.
got
It is cold.
it's we're getting some single digits, some negative numbers with wind chill. We're getting some snow now, finally. So it's good to be in the New England area and enjoying winter. And days are getting longer now, so we like that.
That's right.
But and of course, one thing that we've explored a lot in our show, right, especially for New Englanders, right, is especially in the winter, you're shut in, it's cold, you don't want to go outside, right, and you get a significant challenge as we all age, is this concept of loneliness,
Yeah.
right? And it doesn't always stem from being alone. It often comes from feeling unseen or disconnected, which I know is another theme of our aging cohort, right? They're surrounded by others at parties, and they maybe don't connect as well with other family members. So it's a topic that many of us struggle with in silence, but it really doesn't have to be this way. So
Right.
our guest today is no stranger to the conversation. He's been an entrepreneur, coach, writer whose work focuses on helping people connect more deeply with themselves and others. And through his own experiences and insights, he's developed tools to help us combat loneliness by fostering meaningful, fulfilling relationships. So, from finding the courage to share our true selves to learning how to build communities that support us, today's episode is going to focus on practical tools and strategies to help you feel seen, supported, and connected no matter where you are in life. So, if you're ready to take a step forward, overcoming loneliness and creating deeper connections, stay tuned. This is a conversation you won't want to miss.
That's right, Ben. That's right. And you teed me up perfectly there. Again, our guest today is a serial founder and reinventionist whose career spans leadership development, real estate, education, and startups. Currently, our guest runs a personality test company that's dedicated to helping people architect their lives and careers around what brings them the most joy. Our guest has a deep passion for empowering others to become their fullest selves through teaching, coaching, and writing. His work has reached millions of people worldwide, with his articles and videos featured on platforms like Inc.com, Time, BBC, and the Huffington Post. In his own journey, he has explored the complexities of loneliness, connection, and personal growth, developing powerful tools to help others foster meaningful relationships and overcome feelings of isolation. So, with that introduction, please join me in welcoming Brandon Lee to the Retirement Success in Maine podcast. Brandon, thanks so much for jumping on today.
Yeah, thank you too for having me. It's great to be on and excited for the chat.
Yeah, Brendan, and again, I know we chatted a little bit before, and again, I think there's so many things that we could have been talking about in today's show, but when we kind of did that pre-chat and heard a little bit about loneliness and something that you've worked on and tried to build and engineer, I was like, oh, that's the vein right there. That's something we had to go through, but we're going to get to that in a little bit. But first, of course, we want to introduce our audience to you. So I know you've had a diverse and inspiring career from leadership development to founding companies. Can you just share a little bit about your personal journey and how you found your passion for helping people connect more deeply with themselves and others?
So a little bit about my journey is that I dropped out of college and committed a version of cultural suicide as an Asian American. Like there's a lot plenty of stereotypes, but my parents definitely fit that stereotype. Very much. Yeah, you don't get the A, then okay, brace for a scolding. Um, and I was the youngest of three, and my brother and sister did very well academically. I was more the athlete in the family, so
Mhm.
yeah, didn't do too well on that front. But I dropped out, and dropped out to work with churches, and I did a lot of work in Christianity. Ran like a house church, taught about spirituality, faith development, leadership development, and self-love, stuff like that. And then basically over the next decade, I spent time doing that. I spent time flipping houses. I spent time running an education company. I spent a few years in tech. So yeah, many different chapters, and even in just a short 10 years. But yeah, that's a little high level overview of the arc that I've had.
That's fantastic. I appreciate you sharing that with us and everybody tuning in. And I want to focus on something I just teased up there in your bio a little bit, right? Your writing and content, right? It's resonated with millions around the world. I just want to ask Brandon, what inspired you to explore the topic of loneliness, and why do you think it's such an important issue to address today?
So most of my writing, and also to answer the tail end of the previous question that I didn't
Yeah.
actually answer,
Hmm.
which is like what made you want to decide to help more people? A lot of it just
Yeah.
came out of when I was 19, my first year of college. I remember feeling absolutely lost and clueless as like my first year in college, and like facing the daunting life question of what am I supposed to do with my life? And feeling like I didn't have anyone to talk to. I didn't have a good relationship with my brother or sister at the time. And I didn't feel like I had anyone older than me that I could field those questions with. So I remember sitting down at my college campus and just feeling totally distraught because I felt like someone out there had answers to the life questions that I had, but I just didn't know who they were and I didn't know how to talk to them. So I remember just feeling absolutely lost, trapped, and isolated all at the same time. And I remember thinking, this is the worst feeling in the world, and I don't want to feel
Mm.
this ever again. And I remember like the next thought after that was, you know what? Like one day I'm going to answer these questions and I'm going to have two choices. I can either kind of let everyone else in society fend for themselves the way that I had to fend for myself, or I could maybe contribute to the solution a little. And in my mind, that calculus was very obvious. I'm like, okay, like I'm just
Yeah.
gonna do my best to figure out these answers and then do my best to pass down whatever I've learned. And that was the beginning of that journey. And so even early in my 20s, I started as I made progress on the answers to my big questions, I would start passing them on to guys and girls that were like a year younger than me in school.
Yeah.
And then when it came to the writing, uh, I started my writing mostly on Quora, which is
Mm.
like a question and answer platform. It's like the 2.0 version of Yahoo Answers. And yeah, there are plenty of people all over the world on that, and they would ask similar kinds of questions about life. And so whenever I found a question that I felt my life experience spoke to, then I would write about it. So to get back to Curtis, your question specifically about
Yeah.
loneliness,
Yeah.
yeah, like the moment I dropped out of college, I immediately felt lonely
Sure.
because here all my peers were in college. My entire every person in my extended family went to college. My entire kind of network and upbringing, I did the unthinkable. So I basically had to figure that out for myself multiple times. And so by the time I started writing about loneliness, I had already solved that part of my life twice. And
Mm.
so it just made sense of, hey, like, here's some of my life experience and hopefully it's helpful. And that was the original intention in writing. And I never intended to have millions read my writing. It just happened that way, where like I
Yeah.
guess many enough people resonated with it, shared it, upvoted it, commented on it, that it got that kind of traction. Yeah.
Wow.
Very cool. And Brandon, I know from our conversation, you've kind of described yourself as a reinventionist, right? So
Mhm.
can you talk a little bit about what that means to you and how reinvention has played a role in your personal growth and relationships?
Yeah, like I've briefly hinted at, so all these transitions in my life so far, I've mostly just accepted that that's going to be a norm in my life and career. The trend is that every 3 to 4 years I change directions, and that's been consistent for a decade and a half. So it seems weird to just assume that all of a sudden I'm going to stop doing that. So that's where that comes from, where I've gotten very comfortable and friendly with the concept, idea, process of reinventing myself. Where firstly, it was nonprofit, totally different world than real estate, which was my next thing. Absolutely different world from the world of education that I went into. Absolutely different from the world of tech that I went into after. And now with the personal tasks that I'm building, there are some overlaps, so it's not entirely new, but there's similar principles. It's just a totally different industry, even if I am using similar skills that I'm building on from my past. So it's just a term that I've adopted that I've gotten very comfortable with, and I've, I at this point I just expect that to be a part of my future. So that's how I relate to the term, and so very few people even use that term or identify with that. So I
Yeah.
figured, yeah, this is a pretty unique point in my professional bio, so might as well stick
Yeah.
it in
No,
to
that's
describe.
fantastic. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. And I appreciate you letting us kind of build a little background there, like Ben mentioned, for everybody kind of tuning in here today. Obviously, we do want to kind of get into the main topic here of, again, this idea of battling loneliness and really building connection. Again, a lot of our listeners are retirees or pre-retirees, and we're just trying to kind of consistently kind of move forward with that theme of but one thing, Brandon, that you shared, I think it was on our pre-chat with Ben even, you shared a powerful insight that loneliness isn't just about your physical isolation. It's also relational isolation. So can you just expand on that a little bit and why feeling seen is just so critical for having that connection?
Yeah, so I can't speak as to like what are the absolutes of how everyone and every human on the planet relates to this. But
Sure.
from my experience, the first time I experienced this was actually when I was in high school, where I grew up in church, and I was part of the same youth group, church community for basically my entire life up to that point. And I remember one time sitting at the back of the sanctuary and like my youth group was about 20, 30 people, and I knew most of these people for decade and decade and a half at that point. And I remember just pondering where it's like I like these people I've known for so long, but I don't feel like any of them actually know me.
Mm,
And I remember feeling so surprised by that cognitive dissonance. How is it that they've known me for 20 years or 15 years at that point, and like they don't know some really core aspects of who I am, what I believe, what I think about myself, my deeper innermost thoughts. And I felt like that was a very strange thing to experience as a teenager. And I didn't know how to make sense of it at the time. But I think by the time I got into my 20s, I realized like, oh, like yeah, it's because no one actually knew me, and I didn't. There weren't. I didn't have relationships in which that kind of connection and conversation was normalized, nor did I know how to create that. At the time, I just felt like a victim of my circumstance, and like, oh, maybe this is just what life is.
mm,
But by the time I got into my 20s and experienced other kinds of relationships and got a lot more confidence and a lot more comfortable socially, I developed a lot more meaningful relationships where, yeah, like I have a lot of friends that know the darkest parts of my life, the lowest parts of my life from my past, my recent past, my teenage past, and everything in between. And those have felt like the most meaningful, fulfilling relationships. And so when I have that contrast, I'm like, okay, yeah, I think at least for me, I can confidently say feeling seen is a very core part in my sense of feeling connected and feeling held by a community or just um, feeling grounded in a particular sense. Yeah.
So Brandon, it just kind of listening to that is, you start thinking about it starts getting to a level of trust in relationships, right? Is it's,
Mhm.
because if I don't feel like I can trust you, if I give you some very
Mhm.
sensitive personal information, right? If you go, hey, my darkest fears, or here's my
Yeah.
concerns, or hey, I want to brag about myself for a second and talk
Yeah.
about, hey, I just accomplished something, right? So it goes to kind of this having a kind of a kind of confidence that, hey, I'm putting trust in this relationship, and you're
Mhm.
asking for it reciprocated. And I know
Yeah.
obviously there's a fear of judgment that a lot of us have, right? Which maybe is
Absolutely.
the stopgap of saying, hey, I have a fear of judgment, so I'm not going to share my struggles. I'm not going to share these pieces. So I would imagine that that was probably what you were kind of in experiencing maybe early on in your life. So talk about how maybe just people and just translating that experience for you, how others, maybe even retirees, can overcome this fear of vulnerability and start opening up to others, right? Because again, to what you just said is, hey, I was able to build this, but how did, especially if I've gone for 50, 60 years of my life and I've not shared things, how would you kind of counsel someone to go about kind of overcoming that fear and start opening up?
Sure. So yeah, to answer that, I think it's worth noting a distinction of if we're talking about people that you've known for a long time, like there could be like a really good reason for you to not have that confidence to share vulnerable things. Like
sure.
you think to moments in that relationship where this your friend basically like absolutely makes fun of someone else for a particular aspect of their character or something that they're interested in. And so like you have priors of like, yeah, yeah, maybe this person isn't that open and is not the safest person. So like there's definitely real grounding in that sense. And then there's other contexts where it's like, yeah, if you're meeting someone for the first time, like you don't have any priors on that person. And so that process might be a little different. But to answer the question, I think fundamentally it's about uh, having concrete ways to gauge whether someone can handle that part of you or not. And so, at least when I was younger, I just thought, like, you know what? I want to talk about this. So I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna say that thing. I'm gonna say that part of me and like basically drop the equivalent of a vulnerability bomb and hope that the fallout is okay.
Yeah.
And I didn't have much nuance or no any other way to deliver that. And so at least my process now is basically instead of the concept of dropping a vulnerability bomb that's like very, very intense, well, why don't I start with something that's slightly vulnerable, at least slightly vulnerable for that relationship. So if I've known someone for, say, 10 years, and we've never ventured in a particular topic, so if and I want to talk more about that particular topic, then instead of saying the thing as like straight up, the way that I want to say it, kind of like dance around it a little, like start like a few steps away from it. And like just as an example, would be like if like my mom or my parents would be a good example. Like with my mom, I've never floated the idea for a long time about like having friends that are gay. Like because I grew up in a
Mhm.
very conservative Christian environment, and early in my mid 20s, I made a friend that was gay, and we ended up like living together with a group of a few other friends. So a way that I could have introduced that instead of shocking my mom and saying, "Hey, mom, I live with my new friend and he's gay," that would
Mhm.
probably my mom would probably flip out.
Mm.
But if I just start having a random conversation about like, "Hey, mom, like what do you think about gayness?" and just having like a conversation around it and give
Mm.
her a chance to kind of process her thoughts, externally process, and then just raise a hypothetical. I could be like, oh, okay, like, oh, it's cool. Mom, you think about this about gays? Okay, interesting. Like, so how would you feel if like one of your kids had became friends with someone who was gay? So like
Mm.
I'm keeping it, it's obviously, it's almost like the whole, hey, I'm asking for a friend kind of move.
Yeah.
Right.
But that's a way to kind of depersonalize it, keep it a little hypothetical, and create some plausible ambiguity around that situation. And it's a way to get your feet wet and get a gauge of, okay, like how will this person respond? Um, and yeah, the reality is my mom didn't respond very well, so like I don't really talk about that kind of thing with her because she's proven herself to not have respond well, and so therefore not a person that I want to share this part of my life with, and so
Mm.
that's a lesson learned. But that's much different than me dropping the bomb from the get-go and then
Sure.
creating some relational fallout as a result of that. So
So Brandon,
that would be a
yeah.
concrete way.
Yeah, so Brandon, I really like that because essentially what you're doing and kind of that that relational pattern or that communication pattern, right, is you're creating fire exits along the way, right? Because
Yeah.
if all of a
Hmm.
sudden your
Mm.
mom's saying, "Hey, I'm really not reacting well right from the get-go. I don't even want to talk about someone that is gay."
Yeah.
You can just, as you said, you don't have the bomb that went off, and now you're mad at me personally,
Yeah.
but we're
Hmm.
building towards something, and I can feel like I can exit the conversation without damaging our relationship. Is you can
Yeah.
start kind of probing, I guess, the parameters of what you can and cannot talk about by using that. So
Yep.
I I
Exactly.
really like that
Hmm.
as a thought. So so Brandon, one of the things that we've seen, and one conversation we had on our show was with a lady named Sarah Zeph Geber, and she
Hmm.
was an expert in solo aging. So she didn't have kids, right? So
Mm.
she's aging, and she goes, the problem is that as I'm aging, that look, my parents have passed, my siblings are not around, my friends pass away, right? So she kind of expressed to us one of the big things that she needed to continue to do, where she didn't have kids to look after her as she's aging herself. She had to continue to invest in new friendships, and she had to keep building community. So I know that retirees just in general do this, that their workplace is kind of their community, that's their friend group. They drop that off, and they maybe have a very small percentage of the relationships that they had previously. What
Mhm.
would you give for advice, right? So again, I kind of use Sarah Zef-Geber as the example about solo
Sure.
aging, but even retirees, what would you give advice to someone like looking to form deeper connections at this stage of life? Like how do you can reinvest over time, and how do you continue to find new people that you can kind of build as friends and community?
Yeah. So in my mind, this is not that dissimilar as like any person deciding to move to a new city, for example.
Hmm.
So I've basically done that multiple times, where I basically had to hit a social reset. And so the way, at least from hindsight, the way that I started when I didn't have any starting point was I just went on meetup.com. So looking for sites like meetup.com or Eventbrite and just going to events that are interesting to you. And that's as like a very basic way to meet people that you've never met before. That is the intention of those websites, is to help you find people with similar interests to meet each other. So that's like a simple starting point. But from my experience, going to free events are not like the highest signal way of meeting people that you might really resonate with. Usually, I've found those in maybe communities that have recurring meetups. That's one, or paid communities where there's some barrier of entry where it's like you have to care a little bit extra to be a part of this group. So those have been like the two main mechanisms that 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 I've met a lot of the people that I call friends today is through one of those avenues of an avenue where there's a recurring touch point. So like a monthly meeting, a weekly meeting, a way to like build deeper and recurring touch points with people, or paid communities where it's like the thing that is the North Star that the community is about. You have to care enough about it, and that becomes the commonality factor that becomes the basis for friendship. So in my mind, so for people in that kind of situation is uh, yeah, start with the free thing. Go with Meetup, Eventbrite, stuff like that. If you don't have a really clear starting point, or if you already have clear interests, try looking for community-based things, versions of the thing that you're interested in. So, like if you're really into music, like find some kind of digital or in-person community conversation point that they're really big fans of music. Find a local forum, like an online forum of like music nerds in a particular way. Facebook groups are immensely, I think, powerful for this at this point, where there's so many people that there's literally groups for everything, and the cost to join them is virtually free. At worst, it's just providing your email because you got to answer those questions or whatever.
Sure.
Um, and yeah, and with ChatGPT nowadays and AI, you could three topics. What are some online communities or in-person communities in my particular area that I could check out yeah. And so that like there's so many more tools at our disposal now to support this uh situation. Yeah.
And Brandon, I'll add on just because I think not only just going to kind of those groups makes sense. Brandon, I can see where, I'm going to those meetings and I'm doing the meetups and I'm getting to the interest and I get a good group of people, right? I get community.
Mhm.
But over time, if I stop going to those groups and I stop meeting new people, right, that my circle starts dwindling because eventually people move away or say, things happen, right, in life that it feels kind of natural too that you keep going to those things to keep invested to keep reinvigorating re-energizing that community base. Would you agree with that?
I mean, that is certain. There's ways, I guess, to recreate that don't necessarily require you to continue to physically be present. Um, but I think the effectiveness also depends on your personality. Like in my particular case, I'm nomadic. I travel a lot. So actually, I'm not in the physical geography and I'm not able to do something like that. Right. So
Mhm.
for me, the way that I've maintained that is I have basically weekly recurring digital Zoom interactions with my close friends. And usually these are in the form of co-working, in the form of doing normal mundane life in the same Zoom room. And that's my way for maintaining friendships. Because, well, I can't be in Canada and Puerto Rico and San Francisco and various parts of the US all at the same time, and I'm not quite financially loaded enough to just fly there to develop those relationships. And I'd imagine most people aren't, right? And so that's a way that you can circumvent that if you're not able to keep physically going, is develop your own cadence outside of that community container or context.
Nice
I
tip.
like that. Yeah, that's great. That's great advice there. I want to go back to something you kind of addressed there with the example with a conversation between you and your mother. Just in general, talking about taking small risks to kind of open up these deeper conversations, right? You gave that example of, you start with something slightly personal or asking more thoughtful questions, hypothetical, however you want to do it. I guess
Mhm.
my question, Brandon, is just, are there any other ways or more examples of how listeners might be able to start applying these techniques in their own relationships?
Yeah, so just to give another example, so when I was in real estate, the average person there mostly cared about, like, just to give people a picture, it was almost like, imagine if a frat bro had too much money, and that was like the default kind of that would be the stereotype of the average person that I met during that time.
Got it.
And like people in that space, they're not necessarily going to care so much about like art and personal growth and spirituality and self-reflection. They're just concerned about partying, drinking, girls, and cars. Like those are
Mm,
the main top, and maybe working out, right? And so you would imagine that the other topics that I just mentioned, they're either gonna ridicule those kind of topics, or they're gonna be like, give you squinty eyes, or just be entirely closed off. That I would say more often than that. That's the optics of it. And so if I was like, if for whatever reason, like I was really into spirituality and I wanted to engage in conversation with someone from that world, I'd get something adjacent, and I might start with something like, you know what? Hey, I just read this really interesting book lately, and that would be like a very vague invitational fishing hook of like,
Hmm.
I wonder how they respond to this question.
yep.
And if they're like, oh, cool, well, like what'd you learn? And then that gives me a window of, okay, there's some curiosity here. And maybe I respond with, oh yeah, I was just learning about like a different way to think about how, like, what motivates myself. And so like that's another way to keep it vague. And if they keep biting, basically I'm giving them like progressively more interesting fishing hooks, and
Yeah.
maybe like throwing the fishing reel even deeper or further each time and seeing if they go with me each time. Um, and yeah, basically I keep going until I feel like I hit their point of resistance of either their curiosity dies, or they all of a sudden put their guard up and they're like, oh, like that's weird, or like
Yeah.
that's dumb. But so long as they're curious, is that I take that as open invitation to keep sharing, get a little bit more vulnerable, or like core to how I actually feel about thing, or core to the actual point that I want to share.
Hmm.
So that'd be another example.
Yeah.
So, Brendan, I have a off-script question that I'm just thinking
Sure.
about as you're kind of up with this. Is I think about my grandfather who passed away, I think like 4 or 5 years ago. He was
Mhm.
99 when he passed.
Wow.
World
Yeah.
War II generation. But he lost the majority of his hearing throughout retirement, right? So
Mm.
he had a real tough time. Actually, the bigger the room got with the amount of people, the more he became isolated, right? Because it just became too much noise. He couldn't hear well on a
Mm.
one-on-one basis. He was good. Uh, but when it was multiple conversations happening, he would withdraw. So I guess my question is, look, a lot of us have physical limitations, right? Especially as we age, we're going to develop health issues, physical limitations, things like that. Um, and again, technology might not be our thing, right? Especially with kind of some people, right? So I know you
Yeah.
mentioned
Yeah.
here's like online communities and creating that, but just in the scope of if you were in that situation, you have physical limitations, whether it be sight, hearing, something or physical, I can't move around well. How would you kind of work on investing in community and relationships there? How would you kind of go about that? And again, maybe implying kind of the conversation about what you just said about kind of using conversation to build into relationships.
That's a great question. I think one thing that came to mind was not all relationship building has to be founded on verbal activity. I think this is a common thing that this is a common tactic that we use when I was running the education company. I was working with teens, and I used to be a very disgruntled, moody teenage boy, and we met a lot of moms that like just had no clue how to build trust with them, like relationship with them. Girls, we've noticed, just tend to be very much more okay with getting to know each other just by straight conversation. And we noticed that guys, and including myself with my own hindsight, I I much more prefer doing activities as a way to build trust. And so that one might be one avenue of like, if
Mm.
in your grandpa's case, if he's hard of hearing, it's just like there's a lot of communication that can happen in just like playing a physical game or just doing an activity with them. Like cooking with someone, it's very collaborative. You're working with them. It's very intuitive. There's like physical proximity. There's a lot of unspoken, more body language that can be shared. Or even playing a silly game like there's I don't know, like heads up, sub up, or like playing like rock paper scissors, or like
Yeah.
silly games like Ultimate Ninja. I don't know if people have played that, but or like even crafting activities like painting together, or like
Mm.
like sketching, or using a coloring book together. Like if you have limited like I guess fine dexterity capacities, like you can
Yeah.
figure out other ways. So like just playing catch, like classic American activity,
Yeah.
like like playing catch instead of like out on a field, like literally tossing a bouncy ball around and like seeing how many like if you can land it in the cup, like making it a game out of it.
Sure.
So those are absolute ways to build trust that are very accessible to literally every kind of age. And so that is that would be a fantastic point of connection if someone's more limited.
I love
Awesome.
that. I love that. Those are great examples. Brandon, I want to ask a question. I'm continuing on my theme here of opening people up for deeper conversations and being vulnerable. This time, I want to ask you as the person receiving the deep conversation. So you're the listener in this scenario, okay? So
Mm,
again, as a listener, you highlight the importance of suspending judgment and
mhm.
leaning into curiosity. What are some ways that people can practice this skill and to help create that safe space for others to share more deep conversations with us?
Yeah, so I think ultimately, if you are the kind of person that reacts strongly to information, like you have strong judgments about how people ought to be, their beliefs,
Hmm.
their actions, a lifestyle, uh, it really starts with you. Like you're allowed to keep those beliefs. You're allowed to have those reactions. The question is like, are you happy with the relationships in your life that it's creating? And if you're okay with that, then cool. Like keep your cards like that if that's
Yeah.
working for you, that's working for you. But if you're unhappy, then it's like it's just prime time for reflection in terms of, okay, like why am I so bothered and react so strongly when it comes when I meet people with who say these kinds of things, think these kinds of ways, have these kinds of actions. And it's taking time to unpack that, because unless you examine what's underneath those judgments and why you feel so strongly about it, you're going to keep having those reactions. And until you unpack and understand, well, why is it that I'm so bothered by someone who says these things? Well, oh, okay, it's because it makes me believe that they have like they just have a fundamental level of disrespect and disregard for other people. Well, is that true? Like, is that actually true? Like, if someone says like if someone cusses, uh, like, does that mean that they're just a foul-mouthed, low character, low integrity person? I
Hmm.
mean, maybe sometimes. So like you have to examine those assumptions and be willing to investigate, like, hey, could it be possible that someone cusses a lot but has very high integrity and like lives a life of high moral character? Is that possible? Is like, could there be one person on the planet that actually
Yeah.
exists like that? And
Yep.
if yeah, you're allowed to believe that, like, nope, that's impossible, then like, okay, so, like back to square one. Like you're allowed to maintain that belief.
Sure.
And if you're okay with those relationships, cool. But if you're willing to question those things and examine that route, you might find yourself being more open, like, okay, yeah, like maybe there are people who cuss like a sailor, but actually are really great people. And I just haven't met, but because I shut myself off, I actually don't give them the chance to prove that as that assumption of mine wrong. And so repeating that kind of motion in any aspect of your life in which you have that kind of strong reaction, that could yield a lot of results in meeting and having more conversations with people that poke those kinds of buttons for you. And yeah, you'll have to be ultimately the judge of whether that's a productive use of your time and yields more relationships that you like. But yeah, that would be a concrete way is just examine yourself and what's actually
Mhm.
provoking you and why.
Love that.
Yeah, nice. I like that answer. So Brandon, you've kind of described yourself as being a little nomadic here, right? As kind of
Mhm.
somebody that goes place to place, and obviously, I know from just kind of the aging population that Curtis and I work with, and again, what we've had on the conversation on this show was that a lot of times the retirees especially experience loneliness after major life changes, right? Loss
Mhm.
of a spouse, a move, health challenge, right? And a lot of that I think is just mourning, right? Is I'm mourning kind of what it was, right? And I don't have that anymore. I'd love to hear like you in terms of like, oh, I went, I was in San Francisco and now I'm not. And now I was like, oh man, did I really make a mistake here? Did I really just blow it because I went from someplace I was thriving and doing really well and I had great connections to now I have none of that, right? I don't have the same connections here, different culture, different, rhythms of things. How have you kind of transitioned and kind of gone, hey, not more in the past, but looking forward to the future to be optimistic and hopeful about it? How have you kind of battled that? Because again, I can see where that can be a cause of loneliness and
Sure.
people.
Yeah, I think at a high level, like the more clear the path forward is to you, the easier it is to actually focus on moving forward. And I think so. Like if people are getting caught in the past, part of it is because maybe the future isn't very clear or very reachable. So I basically wouldn't blame anyone for feeling really shitty if their current situation feels very bleak.
Mm.
So I think that's just like a very normal part of the human experience. Is like if you feel clueless and lost about how to move forward and you just left a really good situation, yeah, there's a lot to mourn and that's gotta suck. And I think that's very human reaction. So I think that's part of the intent of this conversation where it's like, okay, like how can we help people construct a path forward? And so at least in my situation, the times that I've had to reset multiple times, it's I've been fortunate in that I've done it before. So basically, if I were to ever restart again from a community standpoint, if we eliminated all my close friends right now, yeah, I'd be very sad that because those were
Mhm.
many years in the making. That would be, yeah, I would be lying if and staying didn't hurt, and I would probably need to take a break to kind of digest the grief from that and the loss of that and the vacuum of those relationships. And I would be pretty okay in the sense of like, all right, like if I want to make it my priority right now to rebuild that, I will do that. And if it's not my priority, then I got to be okay with the consequence of like it's going to be a lonely stretch for a bit until I'm willing to devote my time to it. But yeah, the bottom line is that so long as you are willing to put in the time, the reps to meet the people or find these fishing holes to meet these people and then show up consistently to build those relationships, you will eventually get there. It's purely a numbers game.
Mm.
And if you're willing to do that, you are going to be on your way. It's simply a question of when, not if. But you got to be willing to do that. I don't think there's as much as we all would like to wave a magic wand and have like perfect community tomorrow.
Mm. Yeah.
That's just not how life works. Unfortunately, maybe some small lucky people who win relational lotteries all of a sudden going to stumble into magical communities. But I don't assume that I will ever be one of those. And I wish I could, but for now, I got to rely on just focusing on a process where, yeah, I gotta still meet through a bunch of people to filter and sift down to the people that I really like, build trust with them, and that takes time.
Yeah, this is great, Brandon. I want to keep going here on this, kind of the effort it takes, right, to build this
Mhm.
community around you. And you
Yeah.
just spoke to it. The
Mhm.
persistence, the time, the effort is very important. I guess my question is, it's easy, or it may seem easy for us to sit here and tell people that, right? Stay with it.
Sure.
You can do it. What are some ways that you know and that you can share with people that to really keep them motivated and patient during this process of really trying to find that community after meeting maybe hundreds of people and they still don't love the community around them? Like how can they
Mhm.
stick with it? How can they stay motivated to really find that group?
For me, it was rooted in two things. One, it was actually tracking.
Yeah.
So like I actually had a spreadsheet during this time where I would every single time I had a coffee chat with someone that I didn't know and met for the first time, I would just write notes down about how that conversation went, what I liked about that connection, what I didn't. And I think filling that up and seeing my spreadsheet populate felt encouraging. I'm like,
Mm.
cool, like I actually have met a decent amount of people. Like by the time I filled out like 50 people, I'm like, wow, like I met a lot of people. So that's one. And then two is um, how confident you feel about the fishing holes that you have to meet more people,
Yeah.
right? If that doesn't feel solid, then you're not going to have that sense of optimism because you're just kind of projecting forward and like you're the open question of how am I going to meet more people that are closer to the kinds of people that I want to meet? If that is a question mark, that's not encouraging at all.
Mm.
But
Mm.
for me, like I spent a lot of time during that phase trying to answer the question of like, cool, like I'm gonna try to find these kinds of events. I need to try to find these kinds of communities so that I feel like I have a more consistent stream of interesting people to meet. And so long as that was true, of like, okay, there's this weekly meetup that I came across, and there's usually like 40 people that show up every time. Cool. Like, I feel like I can hang out here for like a good year. And like, if I literally meet everyone, like, that's okay. I have like a year planned out, basically a year
Yeah.
of weeklies meet like planned out here.
Yeah.
So like just like community, like local church community. This is what like local church community used to serve as. Like it's like a
Sure.
fishing hole to
Hmm.
meet interesting people.
Sure.
But like if you're not into that, then it's like finding volunteer clubs, finding local nonprofits to get more involved in, like get involved with your local library, like local government. Those are ways to like that are relatively accessible, volunteer at like soup kitchens or something, and then eventually you'll meet the other people who volunteer regularly, and then that's like another way to do it. Or like if you like local sports, there's a lot of intramural things, or like
Sure.
knitting clubs, or like reading clubs. There's like clubs for everything nowadays. Uh, so like just show up consistently and like um, for the things that of course you're interested in, because it'd be like pulling teeth if you were trying to go to a thing that you
Sure.
didn't actually enjoy. But
Sure.
yeah.
Love that.
So Brandon, I just kind of listening to our conversation today is obviously a key takeaway, which I'm hearing from a lot of things that you're saying is, really is identifying kind of the interests you have, right, is going to be really vital, and matching that to that community of people and kind of finding that shared passion, that shared interest. Because I
Mhm.
just, for, how many people that we see of, hey, uh, kiddos are telling me I got to go to the retirement community, right?
Mhm.
In which we all probably know that that's probably the best place to go to find other people to get easily accessible people with, and then find common interests and then do that. But
Mhm.
the key, kind of the key protest is, well, I'm not old; they're old,
Mhm.
right? Is that
Mhm.
I'm not someone that identifies with them. So
Sure.
what I like is the structure that you're building here is independent of having to go to a centralized place for just maybe just a supported living and helping me live
Sure.
independently. That there's other
Mhm.
things on top of that. What are kind of just one key takeaway that I think you would like to share to our audience on overcoming loneliness and building deeper and more fulfilling relationships? What would you identify just that one thing?
Just one thing.
You get one
Mm.
shot.
Yeah.
Oh man, gotta think about this. I would say so like for most people who are listening, like you've already lived a lot of life, you've already met a lot of people. It is far easier to rekindle warm relationships than to start from scratch.
Hmm.
So in my mind is if you feel like you're isolated right now for your audience, I just pick up the phone, and
Hmm.
I would just start texting, calling, finding whatever, or emailing, and just reaching out to old contacts, catching up with them. Um, like usually like by someone's 50s or 60s or retirement, you've met hundreds of people.
Yeah.
Uh, like arguably, you could literally go through, try to think of every person that you've ever had like a meaningful conversation with, whether in life or work, have a catch-up conversation with them, and that could be the foundations of a new friendship, rekindling something. Or I think my favorite strategy is like if you enjoyed a conversation with someone, asking at the end of that conversation, like, hey, do you have anyone else in your life that would enjoy having this kind of conversation, or like are into the activities that I'm into, that might be
Hmm.
open to chatting? So basically turning every conversation into, for the lack of a better word, like a lead gen process
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
meet
Right.
other people.
Yeah.
And literally, I think people who are in retirement age, if they simply did that, that probably could yield just as much results as I've had. Because I developed my process in my 20s when I didn't know anyone, or like just
Yeah.
Hmm.
hadn't met enough
Yeah.
people in life. So yeah, I feel like that would be a relatively reliable strategy,
I
Love
like that
for
a
that.
someone
lot.
in age.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that a lot, Brandon. It was something I hadn't really thought of, honestly, as we were going through that, but you made a good point because you were building it from scratch, but it doesn't mean that
Mhm.
somebody else can build it now with all the same connections. So I like that. So if you're listening and you're lonely, pick up the phone. You heard him. That's the one thing to
Yeah.
do. I like it. Brandon, I have one kind of final question for you. It's a little bit of a pivot from the theme we've been going through here together. We have to ask it though. So again, the name of our show, right? It's the Retirement Success in Maine podcast.
Mhm.
So I have to ask you a retirement question.
Sure.
Obviously, with your very diverse background here and kind of all the different areas you've specialized in at this point in your life, looking forward now, how are you going to find that personal retirement success? What is that
In
going to
my
look like?
mind,
Yeah,
yeah, in my mind, I feel like I already have that.
I love
And
that.
that's partially because of my definition of retirement. But like, I don't think retirement is about not working anymore. I think retirement is about having the freedom to decide when, where, how often, and what you work on.
I
I think a
love that.
lot of people who like think about retirement is just like, you know what, like I just never have to go to work again. And they end up being bored within like a month
Sure.
because
Hmm.
they don't have anything meaningful to devote themselves to. So retirement, in my mind, is equally important about freedom from having to do things that you don't want to do, but also having freedom to do the things that you actually want. And uh, because of the lifestyle that I've had so far and my career choices so far, largely I'm currently already living a life where I'm mostly already on that track of I'm mostly spending my day doing things that I want to do and mostly not doing things I don't want to do. And I yeah, and I think if given that definition of retirement, I feel like I'm already there. I've already learned the core skills of how to have a successful retirement. Like even if someone gave me $1 million tomorrow, like I don't think I'd be spending my time that much differently.
Yeah.
I'd still want to be working on meaningful things, and the thing that I'm working on right now feels pretty meaningful.
I love
I've
that.
built up a pool of relationships that feel really supportive to me. I don't think I need that many more of those. I don't know if I have enough time for them anyway, if I had
Yeah.
that. Uh, so yeah, I think I'm already there, using a lot of the skills that tactics that we've talked about in this conversation.
Fantastic.
Brandon, that was a great answer. I really appreciate that because again, I think there's freedom to do something and freedom to not do something, and I think you kind of covered that, and that's really cool. Brandon, I want to thank you for coming on our show today. Again, I know just loneliness is a theme that comes up a
Mhm.
lot when Curtis and I are having conversations with folks, and
Mhm.
you develop money, right? But the money doesn't mean if you don't have the other parts of your life really kind of built and developed, and I think
Yeah.
that's something that comes up. So I think this is a really good foundational
Mhm.
library episode that we can share with the folks we work with, but also the public that listens to our show and subscribes. So thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it. We will put your information on our website so people can find out more about you, follow you as well, and thank you again for your time today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
All right, all right, take care, Brandon. Brandon Lee, what was a really cool conversation.
That was
Again, just
awesome.
a different guy than somebody that we're used to interviewing, right? Is
Yeah.
here's somebody that's going around the world and experiencing lots of different ways of life, and kind of interesting to hear kind of this as he goes, different cultures,
Hmm.
different groups of people and interests, how he's plugging in and taking those lessons and then translating it to maybe our own lives and kind of what we see on a daily basis. So again, kind of
Yeah.
good parallels, and I think sometimes you can just reapply lessons that others are really in tune to and inherent to maybe ourselves. So again, I think Brandon did a great job kind of helping us out with that today
Yeah.
and talking about that. So you can find more about our show by going to blog.guidancepointllc.com/108 because we're 108 episodes in
Yep.
now. And you can find more there. You can reach out to Brandon at geniusofu.com. So YOU.com there.
Yep.
And then we will have Brandon's LinkedIn profile. So if you want to follow him, he does post to LinkedIn as well, and you can kind of follow him there and connect with him and kind of see what he's up to. So we'd love to point you to those places. Again, go to our website. You can find the find a little bit more of the links and transcript and things like that. But we really appreciate you tuning into our show. I hope you got something out of today's conversation. I know we certainly did. And if you have anything you want to reach out to us about or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear it. But until then, we'll catch you next time.